Hello and good morning. Thank you everybody for joining us today at the 8th Annual Environmental Justice Symposium. And a very big shout out to the University of Maryland for hosting such an amazing event. And we look forward to talking a little bit more today on some of the efforts that we have here at the National Wildlife Federation. My name is Rebeca Villegas, and I'm the Senior Environmental Justice Program Manager here at NWF. And as we see the devastating impact of the climate crisis and subsequent unnatural disasters that have increased in frequency, it is critical to ensure that impacted communities are front and center in shaping policies that not only address the climate crisis, but also address the economic and public health crisis, syndemics that have further overburdened frontline and fence-line communities. Over the past 2 years, we've witnessed how intra-party policy disagreements and competing legislative priorities shrunk both the size and scope of the Build Back Better framework that the Biden-Harris administration spearheaded to address the multiple issues people across our country are currently facing. These negotiations have led to two critical pieces of legislation: the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was signed into law by President Biden last year, and the Inflation Reductions Act, which is tied to our reconciliation process and recently passed the Senate. The Inflation Reduction Act includes $369 billion in climate change, environmental justice, and energy programs, which have the potential to take us down a path of emission reductions that are critical to achieve by 2030. As the bill moves from the Senate to the House, today we seek to cover provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, tools that are critical in achieving the Justice 40 commitment, and how National Wildlife Federation is building connectivity and community power. But before we kick it off with our set of presentations today, I'd like to kick off our introductions and have you, Dr. Simone Stewart, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we can go into Jessica and Tatiana, and then we can kick it off. So Dr. Stewart, take it away.
Thanks, Rebecca. So my name is Simone Houston Stewart, and I'm an industrial policy specialist currently at the National Wildlife Federation. I'm housed within the Climate and Energy Policy team. And under my purview is all of our industrial decarbonization strategies, as well as our carbon management strategies. So I'm really excited to be here today. I'll throw it to Jessica.
Thanks, Simone, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Arriens. I'm the Program Manager for Climate and Clean Energy Policy at the National Wildlife Federation. I'm also housed in the Climate and Clean Energy Program with Simone. And our program works on a variety of climate policies that cover everything from the natural solutions space to more industrial policies that really have the goal of reducing emissions to make sure we're protecting people and wildlife. Excited to be here with all of you today. I'll turn it over to Tatiana to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tatiana Eaves, and I'm currently the Environmental and Justice Policy Specialist housed in the Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization Program. And I work to provide an environmental and climate justice lens to public policy, engaging stakeholders, building relationships with, and helping to educate policymakers, and helping to manage many of our other programs' projects. And I'll pass it back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Tatiana. And we can kick it off with Dr. Stewart, if you'd like to talk a little bit more about carbon dioxide removal and some of the work that we're doing here at the National Wildlife Federation.
Yeah, thank you so much. If we could just go ahead and advance to the next slide, that'd be great. So I first want to start by setting the stage about what carbon dioxide removal is and exactly why we need it, because I think some people might find it as kind of an odd topic in today's discussion. And so really setting the stage with the IPCC report, which is what most scientists and community organizers and the federal government is using to understand where we are in the climate crisis. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a UN body, has said that we need to limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius in order to stave off the very worst of climate disaster. And so as we continue to fight climate change, this 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius limit is getting ever closer. And so we're often confronted with this temperature degree change as an argument for climate action. So in order to reach net zero, it requires drastic emissions cuts. We have to change exactly what we're doing now, as well as removal of legacy emissions. So one of the questions that I get as an industrial policy specialist working with technological solutions a lot of the time is, why can't we plant more trees? And especially working at National Wildlife Federation, I think that's a question we come across really frequently. And we have to understand, in order to address the solutions that we'll need moving forward, that humanity has swung the pendulum so far away from, the center with the anthropogenic CO2 that we've added to the atmosphere, that it'll take humans and our technology to right that. So planting more trees is definitely something that we should be doing, but we have to think of sustainable and long-term storage to capture CO2 from our environment and store it permanently. And so this is where we look into carbon dioxide removal. So in addition to mitigating the current CO2 that we're emitting into the atmosphere, we have to remove more than 40 gigatons of CO2 emitted per year. And I think 40 gigatons is oftentimes a really difficult number for people to conceptualize. What is a gigaton? What does that mean? And so kind of an analogy that we use at NWF is to say that that's about 40 billion hot air balloons full of CO2 that we have to get rid of in the atmosphere. So it's not possible to do that just with natural solutions. We'll have to have technological solutions on top of it, but both of them play a really important role in the larger suite of solutions we have to fight the climate crisis. And so the carbon dioxide removal industry is a growing and developing industry with a lot of federal backing, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in my presentation. But it's really important that we are a part of this conversation to make sure that the tech and the sector with that covers CDR is deploying the technology responsibly and making sure that it's keeping both people and wildlife in mind as we move forward. Next slide. So kind of a little bit more on the topic of carbon dioxide removal. CDR is not the same thing as carbon capture and storage. And a lot of times they're easily conflated because of the concept of capturing carbon. But carbon dioxide removal is more focused on taking carbon dioxide that exists in our atmosphere, removing it through technological solutions, and storing it permanently or using it in processes to replace fossil fuels or fossil sources. And so both natural and technological solutions fall under this larger umbrella of carbon dioxide removal. So trees, plants, those things that we think of when we traditionally think of carbon dioxide removal are part of the natural climate solutions. But we need tech solutions to do a lot more of the heavy lifting. Not every industry has a readily available alternative. So a lot of times we talk about deploying renewable energy and the infrastructure that will need to do that. But industries like aviation and heavy machinery are still developing in ways that we can make them more sustainable. So for the time being, to make up for those emissions that will otherwise just go into the atmosphere, we think about carbon dioxide removal as a solution for them. And so aviation is an example of that. So it addresses legacy carbon that's been, cycling through our carbon dioxide systems in our planet. And so we have to address the legacy carbon that is still, not being addressed by mitigation strategies. And one of the reasons that carbon dioxide removal is an important contributor to the conversation is because when we talk about equity and justice, it allows for the global north to address its role in the climate crisis. While other countries are still working to develop and work on their own mitigation strategies, this allows countries that are working to advance technological solutions to employ those solutions to then make up for their legacy carbon emissions. And so we know the global north has really contributed mostly to the emissions that have led to the climate crisis. So currently the most developed technological solution is direct air capture. So DAC is a term that is used really frequently in the carbon dioxide removal space, and its current global capacity is about 10,000 tons. And so really, it's not a substitute for mitigation strategies. It's not a substitute for moving to renewables and alternative other zero carbon energy sources, but really that this is the final mile of decarbonization in our society. And so that CO2 can be stored permanently underground where CO2 is naturally occurring, where over time it will mineralize and turn into solid rock, or it can be used as a fossil independent stream of CO2 to create products, including building materials, chemicals and polymers that we use to make all kinds of things that we use every single day, and alternative fuels. So next slide. So we get the question a lot, why is the National Wildlife Federation involved in the carbon management space? And it actually seems kind of like a natural trajectory for us, because conserving natural climate solutions is a part of our NWF mission. So it seems to make sense that we would be involved in subjects that have to do with climate change and climate change solutions that are going to affect wildlife and going to affect people. So natural climate solutions are part of our platform. We conserve wildlife and are trying our best to protect these spaces, but we're also working to combat the climate crisis through the tools that we have. And we recognize that it's broad reaching. It touches both people and wildlife. And so that's all the more reason why we need to be a part of deploying responsible solutions. And what we've seen in the conversations that we've been a part of surrounding carbon management is that it's really important for a conservation voice to be present in the room as decisions are being made, as policy is being advocated for. It's really important that a conservation voice be present while this space is developing so rapidly to ensure that justice and conservation voices are brought with us to the table and that considerations for people and wildlife are made throughout this process. Next slide. And so Rebeca did a great job in the very beginning talking about the moment that we're in, which is really exciting for this sphere. So there are federal policy backing for carbon dioxide removal, both in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so the biggest part of IIJA, the biggest provision is for 4 regional DAC hubs, so direct air capture hubs, and the infrastructure that will be deployed to develop them and create a network to increase the capacity of carbon removal in the United States. And so this will also develop a network of shared infrastructure for transport and storage permanently underground, and it will develop a carbon market. One of the difficult things to incentivize removing carbon from the atmosphere, which is part of the Federal Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act, is that there isn't a price on carbon. There's little to incentivize captured carbon to be stored underground. And so that's often why we see the contentious point of CO2 being used in techniques like enhanced oil recovery, because there is a price on oil, there isn't a price on storing CO2 underground permanently like we should. And so this is where the 45Q tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act comes in, where we are incentivizing companies that are removing CO2 from the atmosphere to store that CO2 permanently underground. And so then there's other relevant legislation, like I said, the Federal Carbon Dioxide Removal Act requires DOE to remove CO2 and increases the amount of CO2 that they're required to move every year. It sets standards for monitoring and rigorous regulation, as well as public transparency, which is really important when we're talking about how this is going to affect communities and how it's going to impact real people. The Clean Competition Act was recently announced, and this is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a trade policy where carbon-intensive manufacturing processes are charged based on their carbon intensity. And so manufacturing is a really carbon intensive process to create things that we need, like cement, steel, aluminum. And so these are processes that aren't going away anytime soon and that we in fact need in order to grow the infrastructure to develop all of the really great things that we see coming down the pipeline through IIJA, including the rapid deployment of renewables. But these emissions intensive industries have to be addressed. And so this is one of the ways that we're looking to do that. And then lastly, the CHIPS Act supports CDR, RD&D to look at nascent technologies and help grow them to scale. Next slide. And so lastly, I want to talk about how NWF is really working to prioritize EJ within the CDR space. And so there's a lot of different mechanisms and scenarios in which carbon dioxide removal can be deployed. And so, NWF supports the types of projects, the environment in which communities are prioritized early, they are consulted often, and consulted with authentic and meaningful engagement and involvement, not kind of just going in and telling a community this is the project that's going to happen here, but working with a community to address their needs. We also support projects that are creating the least impact to local conservation efforts because we want to protect wildlife as we are deploying these climate solutions, and have the lowest impact on supply chains and other resources, and are powered by zero carbon energy sources in order to create a net negative cycle where we're actually removing CO2 and not putting more of it into the atmosphere, and storing it permanently away or supplying it for fossil independent utilization processes. And so NWF is doing more to promote education more broadly and within different sectors within industry and on the Hill to help people better understand the role that CDR can play and the vision that NWF has for an equitable and responsible deployment of CDR. We're spearheading different conversations. And so in 2022, this year and next year, we'll be having conversations in 2 key states where carbon management has really been adopted by the state legislature. And so Wyoming, we're planning to have conversations in 3 different cities and with the Wind River Reservation, which is one of the largest indigenous reservations in the United States and houses 2 different tribes. So working together to talk to the different sectors of the community, all the way from education to labor unions to transitionary jobs, talking to different sectors to better understand how their state's adoption of carbon management strategies and techniques is affecting people on the ground. And so we're really trying to better understand how we can do this in a responsible and just way and learn from the lessons of states that have already developed early implementation. The same is true for what we hope to do in Texas coming up in the future. And these conversations will hopefully lead to the development of a framework that NWF can then take back and continue to build with our partnership with Data for Progress, a progressive polling agency who can help supply the quantitative understanding of how people are responding to carbon management in their state, to ultimately develop a framework and lessons learned regarding the implementation of carbon removal strategies and inform the conversations that NWF is having so we can take community concerns and elevate them, amplify those voices at the federal level where we're advocating for policy, and continue to engage with industry actors to let them know what's happening on the ground and continue to advocate for the people who need it most. So thank you so much for listening, and we're really excited with what we're moving forward with in NWF. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to Jessica.
Thanks, Simone. What a great presentation. And hello again, everyone. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but certainly related, and talk a little bit about our work on environmental justice mapping and screening tools, or EJSM tools. And first, I want to give a little context of these in Justice 40. I don't want to spend too much time on this because hopefully you got to attend a wonderful keynote this morning from Dr. Dylan White-Newsome, who talked a lot of detail about Justice 40. But just so we're all grounded, and to give some background, so this is a Biden-Harris initiative announced in the very early days of the administration that sets a goal that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, or overburdened by pollution. And certain federal investments has been defined to mean sort of certain specific categories like climate change, clean energy, energy efficiency, wastewater infrastructure, a number of other things. So it's a big goal. It's a really historic goal. But as with many big initiatives and goals, the devil's really in the details. And we've been getting more and more of those, certainly over the last year in particular. And as Dr. White-Newsome mentioned, this is not a sort of an announcement of a new pot of money, but agencies are meeting this goal by a combination of new programs, some of which were created in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that Simone mentioned. Some of them are existing programs, but these programs in general, some of them are getting really historic amounts of funding from that bipartisan infrastructure bill and hopefully from the Inflation Reduction Act if we see its passage tomorrow. So agencies have been announcing sort of covered programs under J40, EPA, like that includes things like their Clean School Bus program and their lead removal program, DOE, a lot of things in the energy efficiency space fall into there. So that's just for some context. Now, what the heck do EJSM tools have to do with Justice 40? And we really think they can be a powerful ally in the implementation of this initiative in determining both where environmental justice communities are and what kinds of investments they need. And ideally, they can also be used as an accountability mechanism. So helping us understand whether we're actually meeting the goals of Justice 40 and really helping track progress towards environmental and climate justice. And NWF's focus on these tools has really been in this space and in the policy space and thinking about how can we help ensure these tools are highly effective and highly used, particularly at the federal level, to further climate and environmental justice. And we really want to use these tools to be intentional about identifying where vulnerable communities are and driving investment and enforcement there. So next slide, please. So this slide may look a little wonky. I tried to be cute and do some animations, which didn't work. So I'll explain what you're seeing here. But just to give a brief overview of what these tools are And I will say that there's a number of other presentations during the symposium that are going to dive deeper into these tools, I think including one on Saturday that will talk specifically about the Maryland tool. So there's a lot of other preeminent experts here who are far more technical and genius in this space than I am. So attend those if you want to dive deeper into what these tools are and the sort of the science behind them. But in general, these tools can reveal what kinds of communities are and aren't at risk from environmental and climate hazards. So they include two general sets of indicator types: demographic, so that can be things like linguistic isolation, poverty rates, racial and ethnicity data. And those kind of indicators describe a community's potential susceptibility to different exposures in the environment. And the other general type is environmental indicators. So that can be things like air pollution, water quality, are there Superfund or brownfield sites near where you live, climate variables such as flood risk, wildfire risk. And those kinds of indicators help describe the physical environment or give information about community exposure. So there are two national level tools. The first one is EJ Screen, which is a tool from the EPA, and that's the image behind this. So pretend you can see it. And you can add a bunch of, variables on, as I said, the demographic and the environmental side. EPA, EJ Screen just, I think a few months ago, rolled out a bunch of new variables that have been included. So now there are some climate variables in the tool, including sea level rise data from NOAA and wildfire risk, which is really, really great to see. But this image you're seeing now is from the newest federal tool that was mentioned this morning in the keynote, the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool from CEQ. And its origin is the same executive order that created J40, mandated the creation of this tool. And it's really explicitly designed to help fulfill Justice 40 and with federal resource allocation purposes in mind. So what you're looking at here, the tool says whether a community is disadvantaged or not. And the highlighted county there is Whitesburg, Kentucky, which is an area of Eastern Kentucky. That's one of the areas in Appalachia that has been really devastated by the recent flooding. And you can see this community is, yes, disadvantaged. And so the beta version of this tool was released in February. The CEQ had a feedback process, and I believe they're incorporating that feedback and will be releasing a new version of this tool, hopefully this year. And you can see here the categories of indicators that it determines whether a community is disadvantaged or not match the categories of J40 covered investments. So climate change, clean energy, energy efficiency, clean transit, those things I mentioned earlier. So yeah, that's just some grounding and what the heck these tools are. We can go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned previously, NWF's work in this area has been less on the technical development of the tools and more on the policy side. And before I talk a little bit about what that work has entailed, I want to stress that none of it would be possible without the expertise and leadership of Dr. Jacoby Wilson and the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health. They have been collaborators with NWF on all of this work, thought leaders in this space. And I just want to start out by acknowledging none of this would be possible without them and their leadership. So our focus has been on how can we integrate these tools into decision-making at the federal level, because our team really focuses on federal policy, especially for climate action and climate equity. As I mentioned up top, I'm on the climate and clean energy team. So climate's sort of the focus of a lot of my work. But also our focus has been on aiming for increased awareness of these tools and their potential with the policymaker audience. A tool is great, but it's only good if people use it and know how to use it. And we think a lot more of this could actually be happening at the national, also at the subnational level. And these tools certainly are not silver bullets to solve the problems EJ communities are facing, but they should be part of the solution. So this work in August 2020, we released an initial white paper that sort of was the launch of this work with Dr. Wilson that talked about what these tools are, that was really designed for the policymaker audience, and introduced them as critical resources for anyone interested in furthering environmental and climate justice. And then over the last year, we were interested in exploring some of the questions here on the screen, which we talked a little bit about in that initial white paper a little further, especially knowing that CEQ was working on a new tool and knowing that the Biden administration was continuing to roll out and think about how to implement J40 and how to sort of track progress there. So we were interested in, if we really want to use these tools to get a really full picture of environmental justice and climate justice, what kinds of indicators do we need to include? And that you can imagine that can be a really big list. And then the perennial question for us is, how do we integrate these tools into policymaking? And ideally, what that's going to do is provide more funds to vulnerable communities, but also, a side effect and a really great one of that is help develop some trust between these vulnerable communities and government agencies. So those are the questions we were really interested in exploring. If you can go to the next slide, please. So that work resulted in a report, Gaps in Environmental Justice Screening and Mapping Tools and Potential New Indicators, that we released earlier this year. The authors of that report are on the screen. They deserve all the praise for their work and especially the really deep literature review they did to put this report together. And what the report does is reviews existing EJSM tools at the federal and state level and identifies, and actually some city tools as well, and identifies gaps in the kinds of information they map. And then those gaps were used to inform a new set of recommended indicators that fall into 6 broad themes, which are listed here on the slide, that we argue better represent climate equity and resilience and also optimize proficiency in quantifying climate disparities. So within each of these indicator themes, we identify about 20 specific indicators, some of which data sets to measure it currently exist. Some of have an associated metric that sort of talks about how you could calculate or get that indicator. And if you're interested in learning more, the paper, I can try and drop the link in the chat once I figure out how to do that. The paper is online and it has a really detailed appendix that has like a full literature review that links to all of the sources for this. So I encourage you to check it out if you want to dive deeper. And I'll just talk about a few of these indicators to give you a sense of why they're important. Economic progress, that can include things like an increase in the minimum wage, energy burden, income inequality. Social progress can be things like access to broadband, the amount of unhoused population in an area, whether a community has inclusionary zoning policies. And I like highlighting these because I think those kinds of indicators may not on the surface seem really related to climate and understanding, climate impacts or climate vulnerability, but they're actually really key to understanding how communities can respond to climate change. We know that low-income communities are much more vulnerable to climate impacts than higher medium income ones. And research has shown that the ability to absorb climate stress is connected to all sorts of economic related factors. So you can imagine like having a car, having access to credit, having, a nest egg, all of those things impact whether you're able to recover or bounce back, be resilient in the face of climate impacts. So those kinds of economic and social progress indicators, which are largely missing from current tools, are actually really important if we want to get that holistic, accurate understanding of environmental justice, climate equity. Resilience is another indicator that's, I think, going to be increasingly important to think about measuring and screening in these tools as climate impacts are increasing, unfortunately. That can include things like the number of elevated homes, which you can imagine is really good for understanding flood resilience in a coastal community, or the percent of households with AC. I think we saw how important that indicator was if you were paying attention to the heat wave in Europe, or an area or countries that didn't have the infrastructure to handle extreme heat like that. And there's a lot of indicators we recommend, and I do want to highlight there's sort of ways to do this to incorporate all these indicators into tools so you're not sort of crowding them and not being statistically noisy. And we talk about some of that in the report. Next slide, please. So the report also includes a series of policy recommendations. And again, there's more in the paper. I just want to touch on a few here. So the first, communicating and brainstorming indicators with community members to reflect lived expertise, really, really important. Indicators are most helpful when they reflect a community's values and priorities and are designed with input from community members themselves. So it makes a stronger tool, a better tool, but also this adheres to one of the pillars of environmental justice, right? We want to ensure EJ communities are deeply engaged in, meaningfully engaged in, and benefit from research that takes place in those communities. Developing regional hotspot crisis teams. So I think this is kind of a neat example of how these tools can be used really tactically or practically to further environmental and climate justice. So in the paper, we talk about that these teams could be run out of CEQ and could be regionally focused, so they can be really targeted to the unique needs of regional climates and regional climate impacts. Screening for cumulative impacts. We argue this is really important to get a full picture of disadvantaged communities. Cumulative impacts encompass the totality of stressors individuals experience. The climate and economic justice screening tool from CEQ does not directly address cumulative impacts because it's sort of a binary, either you're disadvantaged or not. And so cumulative impact score would be we argue, be really, really important because you're getting a more holistic sort of measure of environmental justice and climate justice. And then the last one I have here on the slide, using these tools to inform the federal funding distribution. This is really, really key, right? We want, as I said before, a tool is only good if people are using it and know how to use it. And you can use, think about, can we use this tool to prioritize grant applications? Can we use this tool to highlight resource gaps that agencies can then think about building programs or targeting program resources to? Can we use this tool to learn about communities the government programs are supposed to serve? There's so many opportunities to sort of plug these tools into existing program guidance and how we're funneling money and how we're distributing money to states and communities. And we try and argue that more of that needs to be happening and try and show how it can happen. And on that note, last slide, please. So I focused on federal examples, the EPA EJ screen and the CEQ tool so far, but the report and our work has really highlighted and also learned from how states and other cities, counties are using these tools and laws. So I want to spend a minute talking about those. Once again, I tried to be cute with animations here, so apologies for the wonky images. But the image behind the first one is from California's tool, CalEnviroScreen. That tool actually does have a cumulative impact analysis. It calculates an EJ score, which is really key. But I mean, this tool is in many ways kind of the gold standard of these tools. And I think there's so much we can learn, I think, but really in how the tool has been embedded into decision-making in the state in so many interesting different ways. So like, for example, the State Department of Toxic Substances Control uses CalEnviroScreen to determine like where to prioritize enforcement actions. There's also state laws where every city and county in California has to think about environmental justice communities in their long-term development planning, and they have to use this tool to identify where those communities are. So the state was really thoughtful about the tool was sort of built into decision-making in really specific and concrete ways, which makes the tool more useful and hopefully contributes to environmental justice and climate justice. And then the image you see here on top is actually from Maryland's tool, MDA EG Screen, which are the wonderful team that's putting together the symposium has led the development and upkeep of. And this is showing overall pollution burden in parts of PG County and Montgomery counties. Darker colors indicate higher pollution exposure. And the red dots here are something I want to point out. Another thing I think talking about learning from state tools, these red dots indicate the location of supermarkets. And that may not have been sort of an indicator you would think to include, but when this tool was being developed, the team did a lot of community surveys and community outreach. And folks said, access to fresh food is a really big deal for us, and it's an environmental justice issue, and we want that indicator in the tool. And so it was included in the tool. So this is a good example of you're only going to get that kind of feedback if you're actually doing community outreach when you're building these tools and getting indicators. So there's a lot more examples of state tools from the Houston region, from Washington, Florida, Ohio. So much we can learn from how states have developed these, both in how they've funded them, how they put them together, how they've engaged communities in their development, but also how they're used in policy. And where part of the work at NWF and with my team has also been trying to elevate these best lessons learned from the states at the federal level and say, like, what can we learn and take from here to make EPA EJ Screen, to make this new climate and economic justice screening tool really, really effective. And hopefully that's a good transition into Tatiana's section, who's going to talk a little bit more about how we do that kind of learning from states work across more of our environmental justice work at NWF. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Jessie. So hi, everyone. I'll be talking about our environmental justice, climate, and community revitalization program here at the National Wildlife Federation. Next slide, please. So this program was built upon the 17 principles of environmental justice and the Jemez principles for democratic organizing. Our team intentionally prioritizes and uplifts the voices of Black, Indigenous, Latine, Asian, Pacific Islander, and communities of lower wealth on the front lines. In that, we consult and collaborate with environmental justice leaders, impacted communities, and partners, including local, state, and federal elected officials and government agents, on programs and policy advocacy to address local environmental injustices. Among our many roles, we take on the focus of being the connectors. We approach our work in multiple ways to ensure that we're doing our part to build a representative and intersectional conservation movement. And I will go through each of these 6 areas illustrated in the flowchart to the right. Next slide, please. So first, we work to connect communities to resources. So empowering people on the ground with information about new legislation, funding opportunities, tools, and engagement opportunities, such as providing technical assistance or distributing information to address infrastructure, climate-induced flooding, and other issues. Next, we work to connect people and build relationships across sectors. So bringing together community leaders, advocacy organizations, institutions, government agents, elected officials, among others, to work together and address these local environmental injustices. And we also connect policymakers to community perspectives, not only to apply an environmental justice lens to public policy, when consulting with our partners on the federal and state level, but to ensure that stakeholders have a seat at the table when policies that will impact their communities are crafted. Next slide, please. We prioritize connecting and elevating intergenerational voices, as a representative conservation movement must be intergenerational. So we collaborate with youth, elders, and the generations in between and work together to build awareness, understanding, and gain diverse perspectives on the journey to building power among historically marginalized communities. And we do this through our work with our college and high school internships and initiatives and engagement with faith leaders, among many other opportunities. We also work to connect art and culture to the work because we understand the crucial role art, culture, and storytelling has always played in education, community building, and activism or movements against inequality, oppression, and injustice. And we infuse this into our initiatives and the work that we engage within. And lastly, we remember the interconnected nature of all of these issues and life more generally. We work together with our partners to remember the importance of tending to our community members and ourselves and cultivating a personal connection and stewardship of the land around us. Next slide, please. In our approach to this work as a program, we are iterative and holistic. Therefore, we tackle this work from multiple levels. Frontline and fence-line communities are the foundation of our work. Those are the people we serve, our priority. Everything we do comes back to community and how decisions will actually impact individual people. But we also work on the national level and in public policy on the federal, state, and local level. This is an iterative process, as the arrows indicate on this pyramid. We work from the bottom up, so to speak, and also the top down. And I'll discuss a bit more on this later, but first let's dive deeper into each of these three areas of our work. Next slide. On the community and regional level, we focus on movement building and helping to further build out assets already existing in communities so that they can utilize available tools and become more competitive in accessing resources. We meet people where they are and with the understanding that they are the experts of their own lived experiences and know what the issues are that need to be addressed and usually also how to solve them. We move at the speed of trust and are honest and authentic in our approach and intention so that we can foster those deep, long-lasting relationships. For example, we've worked in Benton Harbor, Michigan, where we collaborate and strategize with community-based organizations on how to best lend our resources at NWF and support to address severe lead contamination levels in Benton Harbor, which has thus far included raising awareness around the water crisis through opinion pieces and reports and providing community leaders with resources and information that stem from federal opportunities, such as the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. We also recently sponsored and attended a community meeting to engage with people on the ground and in person in May of 2022. Also, our work in Jackson, Mississippi, we worked with community partners to address the issues of affordable housing and water and utility affordability and educational opportunities to provide financial literacy information to empower residents as they tackle these issues around climate-induced flooding. And with the help of multiple local partners, we completed community outreach campaigns, an internship program that we launched, and completed a legislative briefing on new funds incoming from the federal level, among other outcomes from that relationship we've had. And another example I'll mention is our work in Mount Vernon, New York. So we worked in partnership with community and multiple other partners at various levels to raise awareness to Mount Vernon's decade-long sewage and wastewater infrastructure issues. We connected them with key experts from Flint, Michigan, provided technical support, and worked to use our platform to uplift the voices of the community, which recently led to a $150 million investment by the governor to replace Mount Vernon's aging water and sewage infrastructure. And we could not have done that without our partners on the ground and at different levels of government in Mount Vernon and the municipality as well. And so these are just a few examples, as we have ongoing relationships with various community leaders, state staff, advocacy organizations, and others who we partner with and strategize with on how to best lend our resources and support these leaders and experts in addressing issues from climate-induced flooding, water and sewage, to infrastructure and various other public health related issues. Next slide, please. So on the national level, we use our platform to elevate the voices, priorities, and goals of frontline and fenceline communities. We bring together a cross-cultural, multi-sector collaborative of organizations and leaders of color across the nation to advance a shared vision of the future. Two examples of recent initiatives include the development of the Clean Economy Coalition of Color, which is a regular convening of BIPOC leaders to amplify ideas, recommendations, and solutions to uplift the priorities and economic interests of historically marginalized communities to move toward a clean and just transition. And additionally, we created a Safe Spaces initiative that was focused on engaging experts, policymakers, and activists to elevate issues, concerns, and potential solutions to address the lack of access and enjoyment of the outdoors for marginalized identity groups. Next slide, please. Now, in reference to public policy, the respective programs of the panel today, we are all housed within NWF's National Advocacy Center, which serves as a critical hub of information for NWF departments, regional offices, members, affiliates, allies, and coalition partners, and acts as a force for advancing NWF's mission in helping to build this stronger, more diverse conservation movement. As the environmental justice team, we work from the top down, so to speak, as I alluded to earlier, making sure that frontline and fenceline disinvested communities may become aware of policies, initiatives, and funding that may come down from the federal or state level. For example, we work to break down the bipartisan infrastructure bill so that communities could be in the ready to apply for funding as the money becomes available. And as I mentioned earlier, we held the legislative briefing, and it was on the COVID-19 funds that were allocated for states with the American Rescue Plan so that we could break down what funds would become available and what they could be used for. But we also work from that bottom up level. So working with our various partners at the higher levels of government to elevate the voices and concerns of community leaders to make sure that all voices are heard and have a seat at the decision-making table. For example, we hold a bi-monthly interagency environmental justice call between our program team and federal agency staff that are tasked with doing environmental justice work to share resources, ask questions, and provide updates across teams to increase access and availability of funding and other resources across disinvested frontline communities, with the goal of these convenings being to work collaboratively and synergistically to promote equity and environmental justice across federal agency programs and initiatives. Next slide, please. So right now we are in a crucial moment. The climate crisis demands immediate action to address these historical injustices and mitigate future harms. And as my other panelists have mentioned, with the passage of the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, it's now time for implementation and making sure that the funding doesn't go to the usual players in the largest cities with the largest capacity to research this information and write for these grant applications, but it actually makes it to the communities that need it most. So there's a $1.2 trillion in funding available over 5 years for infrastructure programs across the water, energy, building, and transportation sectors to improve our vast and aging infrastructure across the country. As Jesse mentioned earlier, environmental justice screening and mapping tools, if developed holistically, are important to utilize in this process to empower people and local governments with information and data to unlock resources for tackling these local challenges. In addition, the very recent passage in the Senate of the Inflation Reduction Act is another good start by our federal government, as it makes $60 billion available for environmental justice priorities and contains other large investments to address the climate crisis, which is a historic investment, and we recognize that as a win and are looking forward to its passage. However, along with all of the positive items included in the package, there are significant trade-offs and shortcomings. As we take stock of this moment, we as a program commit to further educating our partners on the ground about this landmark proposal, while simultaneously reaffirming our commitment to working in this iterative way of collaborating with local leaders to build movements on the ground and tackling issues locally, advocating for the solutions that community leaders already know exist for the issues faced. In addition, holding our leaders accountable, as now Congress and the White House must build upon this foundation to ensure that wildlife, frontline communities, and proven natural resilience investments are not left behind. And we have this historic opportunity, and it's important to address this from all levels with federal policy and advocacy on the ground. And now more than ever, we need to work together to reduce emissions and create a healthy, livable environment for all. And it will take all of us to do it. And with that, I thank you all so much for your time. Next slide, please. Yeah, and please visit our website for more information on all of the work that we have talked about today. And I will pass it back to Rebeca.
Wow, thank you so much. It's just such an honor, honestly, to work with these amazing women, and so really happy to be here and to moderate the next section of today. And so for folks that are currently watching, please feel free to submit your questions. We're collecting them at this moment, but we do have a couple other questions as well that we want to tackle, because here at National Wildlife Federation, we don't like to run from controversy, right? We want to make sure that we address the real issues that are impacting folks, right? And so today, how about we start with you, Dr. Stewart? Can you discuss some of the concerns environmental justice organizations have raised as it pertains to carbon dioxide removal? And, you talked a little bit about this in your presentation, but how are we, navigating these discussions and honoring the issues raised by frontline and fence line communities?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rebecca. The carbon management sphere is often one that people discuss as frequently being at odds with environmental justice. And so I think that through the process that NWF has gone through, growing this sector under industrial policy and trying to have really important and intentional conversations, we've really found that there is this very tough crossroads that we're at with, prioritizing people's values and prioritizing the protection of communities, and also, moving in a direction that science is gearing us towards. And I think that historically, we have amplified the voice of scientists and of industry over the voices of communities. And I think that this sector building itself from more nascent kind of research stages into where we're going with with IIJA is a perfect opportunity for us to kind of reformat how we decide to build infrastructure and build these sectors as we deploy climate solutions to really center communities in this process. And so some of what the concerns communities have is that, this is going to prolong the oil and gas industry. It's not moving away from fossil fuels fast enough. There's concerns that this money could have gone to other things. And I think that a lot of times communities bring up those types of concerns from really valid places. If we look at the oil and gas industry historically, it's really disenfranchised communities that bear the brunt of the climate crisis because of that. And so there is a concern about accountability moving forward, especially because a lot of the same players are involved in the carbon management space. So I think, NWF in our conversations, we really try to affirm and validate the concerns that people have. There is a right and a wrong way to implement any kind of technology. And so moving forward, we have to continue to discuss carbon removal in the context of this is not a crutch to lean on. This isn't an excuse to continue, burning fossil fuels. We have to do this in addition to deploying renewables, mitigating our fossil fuel use right now. This is just recognizing that beyond what we can do, the steps that we can take to protect communities and mitigate our uses and stop producing CO2, even if we do that, there's still going to be CO2 in the atmosphere we have to address, that legacy carbon that I talked about. And the communities that will bear the brunt of the climate crisis based on those legacy emissions are often these same vulnerable and disenfranchised communities. So we really have to center carbon dioxide removal in the conversation as a part of many solutions. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a crutch to keep emitting, and continue to amplify the voices of communities and validate their concerns as we continue to develop and deploy solutions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart, for sharing those remarks. And as well, just one thing that I'll add is, through our environmental justice, climate and community revitalization program, we have the opportunity really to ensure that these voices are heard and elevated as these different technologies are deployed, right? And so it's getting ahead of the issues in conversation to ensure folks are able to benefit from the opportunities at hand. I'm so excited to hear about the efforts that are happening in Wyoming, and I think you'd like to share a little bit more as well. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that Tatiana, I think, really hit this point home that, the structure of that from bottom to top and top to bottom, that iterative structure is applied everywhere throughout NWF, and it's really how we work. And so the more engagement we have with communities, the more opportunities that we have to discuss really difficult conversations, exactly like you said, because at NWF we don't shy away from that. The more that we can take and bring into those national conversations and advocate in public policy. And so we're trying to do our best as to recognize community voices and continue to amplify them and advocate for them at other levels, taking exactly what they're telling us and bringing those into conversations with the people who are really making these decisions at the top level.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart. And would others, Jessica, Tatiana, would you like to weigh in as well? All right. Yeah, doctors, oh, go ahead, Jessica.
I think that Dr. Stewart answered it beautifully. I think it's really useful to reiterate that last point she made about not shying away from these tough conversations, but also using NWF's position and privilege and the ability that we have to get into the doors of folks on the Hill, to get into the doors of funders, to get into the doors of industry, and make sure we're then thinking of the bottom of that pyramid that Tatiana showed, then we're bringing those concerns to those places. So I think that's one of the ways, this is a great example of one of the ways we as sort of a big green can use our position and privilege to make sure we're bringing forth environmental justice communities and those concerns, and make just using our position in that way. I think this our work in the CDR space is a really great example of how we try and do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we look forward to also as things progress and move forward. Dr. Stewart mentioned those lessons learned and best practices with existing deployment and infrastructure. And so there's going to be a lot of great opportunities to continue to learn and grow and ensure that as policy moves forward, it's done in a way that honors the realities that folks are facing. And so thank you. And speaking of silver bullets and things, opportunities for it to continue to be refined, Jessica, you mentioned the environmental justice screening and mapping tools aren't as not being a silver bullet either, right? As well as you mentioned through your presentation, there's so many ways in which you can continue to refine these different tools, right? And so how can we, further enhance these tools to address community needs, whether that's through the report or the work that you've done? How can we continue to just move these tools in the right direction?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. And I think it's maybe useful to spend just a few more seconds on they're not a silver bullet. No tool is going to be, but I think also, GIS tools are always going to be limited by what area they're looking at, the data granularity. There's going to be issues with getting appropriate data for the region. There's going to be issues with maybe a lot of the public health data that we'd love to see included in these tools. There's issues with privacy and HIPAA there. There's trade-offs in indicator accuracy. So there's all these other things that, these tools aren't perfect, but they're, so that just answering that, why they're not a silver bullet question. I think there's a couple ways that we can further enhance them to sort of help meet community needs. One is thinking of these tools as playing a role in initial fact finding, and then using the tools to identify potential exposures, climate impacts, and then do some ground truthing on the ground to figure out the particular combination of factors that can lead to what each community is experiencing and how they're being impacted by, environmental climate variables. So they can serve to like do some high level research, and then we need to be ground truthing that. I think others, we can make sure these tools are, this is a simple one, but an important one, are properly funded and maintained and upkept. The funds there should also include support to make sure folks know that these tools exist and know how to use them. And that it can include, making sure there are webinars in different languages, so that we're making sure these tools are as accessible as possible to as wide of a group as possible. There should be a really robust community input process. So and I mentioned that as one of the recommendations in that report I talked about, but like indicators should be brainstormed with community members. When CEQ built their climate and economic justice screening tool, there was a request for information, which is like a formal federal government process that agencies can use to solicit information on a bunch of different questions. So that happened with CEQ and this tool, and they should be integrating a bunch of feedback that was submitted into the next version. And ideally, that's going to happen iteratively again and again and again, because there's always going to be ways to improve and make the tool better. There's always going to be maybe new indicators or new impacts or things like that need to be included in the tool. And, but RFIs are a more formal federal government process. They're not always the most accessible. They're kind of sometimes a wonky DC thing. So there's also a barrier sometimes in making sure that community groups know that it's even a thing, that they can submit responses. And that's another thing that, we try and do at NWF, is making sure that we're plugged into those RFI processes, and then we're making sure we're connecting that with community groups we work with on the ground. And I think the one final thing I'll say on this is support for state and local tools. So one of the reasons these tools aren't a silver bullet, especially at the national level, is there's issues with, there's indicators that may be really relevant in one community that aren't as relevant nationally. So like the supermarket access, right? That data is probably not available nationally, but it's really important for Maryland. And that's what they discovered when they built that tool. California's tool includes an indicator of pesticide exposure because the agricultural industry in California is so huge and impacts a lot of EJ communities in the state. That data is maybe not less important nationally. So thinking about, can we support states to build their own tools that can be a little more honed, a little more specific to the impacts that are important for communities there, even cities, counties, to build their own tools, and how can we ensure interoperability with the federal tools? So thinking through, we need support for the tools that EPA and CEQ are working on, but we also ideally want support for states, cities, counties to be building their own tools that can be really specific and they can drill down on the issues in the communities they cover. So I think those are some answers.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add on to that. Jesse, I loved the example of the grocery stores locally, because I think that it's really, I just want to harp on that fact that you mentioned, just like making sure that this is something that communities, find value in. And so all of these metrics are really like thoroughly crafted with the community's involvement. And also just making sure that, it's an iterative process and that we're always engaging with people and saying, okay, is this still working? Is this still a useful metric? Do we need to expand this? Using other states' tools as examples, using federal tools as examples, and really working to have all of these resources that can actually become usable. Because sometimes I think that we get to the point of having so many different tools and everyone doing different things and not really working in a synergistic way. And so I think that it would be really crucial to make sure that everyone's involved in all of the steps in crafting these tools and in the implementation and education of the tools as well. So I just wanted to harp on those points.
I also just wanted to add, and to kind of shout out to the other wonderful and talented women on my panel, that from an engineering perspective, tools are limited by the people who create them. And so, I really think it's also important for us to acknowledge that there has to be a more robust conversation about the diversity present in STEM programs and in the programs that are teaching people how to build these tools. We see all of the time that engineering feats or tools that we develop are limited by the people who create them. There's plenty of examples of racism throughout Silicon Valley in the tools that we develop and in the products that we use every day, like Google. And so, some of it is tracked back to the lack of diversity in and representation in those spaces. And so I think, just a side note to advocate for, the collaboration with minority serving institutions like HBCUs and, indigenous education systems to build the next generation of people who can create these types of tools, who are going to inherently build their lived experiences into them. So just as a Black woman in STEM, I think it's really important that we advocate that the tool makers are also representative of the communities that we're talking about, as well, because I think that's just another way to make them even more robust and powerful.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. So thank you so much. And I'm glad that you all kind of covered the certain pieces that I wanted to underscore as well in regards to community engagement, in regards to localizing these different impacts, and also providing folks with the resources and tools to and access to the information and data, right? So that they can be able to utilize all these different pieces to help move forward and assess like local development, for example, or all these other pieces. So there's just so much that we can do if we connect the dots and continue to put folks that are impacted first at the front line. And so thank you all so much. And I just want to remind everybody who's out there watching us this morning and this afternoon, for folks, depending on where you are in the nation, to please upload your comments and questions that you have so that we can address those. And we saw one comment from Mary Simpkins. So thank you, Mary. We will get to your question. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you, Tatiana, Jessica mentioned a little bit about big green organizations and just recognizing that the National Wildlife Federation is a big green, right? A big green institution with a complicated history of often centering wildlife and not people. What is currently happening to repair harm and build trust among environmental justice organizations and others?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Rebecca. So I think first, it's important to always come in with that knowledge, and addressing not only the privilege we have as a big green organization, but those historical harms we've caused, right? So the problematic historic leaders of the conservation movement and the concept of preservation and pristine environment, which resulted in the displacement of people from their native lands, among many other harms, and opens conversations about who even had access to that new pristine conserved land. And all of this has real lasting impacts on how people view like the conservation movement and the role of big green organizations. And so we acknowledge our role in that in the last 80 years. And we are in a transformative stage right now in integrating environmental justice and equity and justice, and have been for years now. We've done a lot of work internally with working to institutionalize environmental justice practices and principles across the Federation's programs, with trainings and a complete environmental justice primer with clear goals and a strategy to move forward. And also when engaging with external partners and building relationships, we have to make sure to maintain open and honest communication and to not be extractive, right? Because I feel like that's the nature of a lot of these relationships sometimes when you're parachuting into communities or into people's work. And we have to ensure that we're always respecting the time and expertise of external partners by not only compensating people for their time, but by providing resources and support that they actually find value in. And last note is always remembering that it takes time to build trust. So being patient and open to listen to people on how we can continue to improve and grow and do better as an organization.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. And just to get to Mary Simpkins' question around data collection and program evaluation. And so for folks that aren't on YouTube, Mary asked if there are any data collection or program evaluation tools that measure outcomes. And so one thing that I wanted to underscore that Tatiana had mentioned was our NWF Environmental Justice Primer. And so just to give folks a little bit more context and how you kind of see this connectivity between all the different teams and just, our overall perspectives on environmental justice. We've been hard at work at the National Wildlife Federation over the past 2 years, undergoing an environmental justice analysis. And so with the support of our partners, Skio Solutions and Metropolitan Group, including the amazing Bernice Travis Miller, who is also part of the different panel discussions, we've been able to assess our entire federation. So not only thinking about our programs and our policies, but also thinking about our affiliate organizations. And so something unique and different about the National Wildlife Federation is that our governing body is made up of our affiliates. And so we have 53 affiliates in every state and territory. And so collectively, that is kind of where our power comes. And a lot of these folks are the ones that rise to our board of directors. And so it's folks that really have an impact overall on our governance. And so it's so key as our first partners and affiliate organizations that we're in the same page, right, as we continue to integrate equity and justice and environmental justice across the federation. And so in addition to working with our staff and our affiliates, of course, our board of directors are the key decision kind of makers and leaders at the federation. It was so essential for us to be able to assess at all these different levels and sectors what we can do better to integrate environmental justice within our entire kind of practices and policies. And so after 2 years of focus groups and interviews and lots of discussions and surveys, we were able to create several different training opportunities to ensure that as existing staff and new staff that come on are understanding of the environmental justice movement, that folks understand the conservation movement and the National Wildlife Federation's kind of position in all of that as well. And also thinking about, in addition to training, how are we ensuring that we're assessing kind of our programs? And so that's where the NWF Environmental Justice Primer comes in, where we have a scorecard, an environmental justice scorecard that's very specific, again, to our federation, the unique way in which our organization runs. And we were able to cultivate several different recommendations and pieces with our partners to help us assess, how we're doing currently in the environmental justice sphere, but how can we improve moving forward as well. And so we're excited that after 2 years of all this amazing work and training and opportunities, all of our staff, which is almost 400 staff, and our affiliate members and our board of directors are engaging in all of the training, the work, the primer to start to develop their environmental justice action plans. And so currently, again, folks are assessing their programs using the scorecard that was co-created by the entire federation to help ensure that as we're moving forward, we're using the same language, we're going through the same outcomes. And ultimately, right, our goal is to ensure that we aren't, as our policy moves forward, as our programs continue to grow and develop, that we're not causing adverse impacts, right? And one thing that you'll hear oftentimes, which is why it's so important for, big green organizations like National Wildlife Federation to develop these relationships and honor the realities and the history is because, we haven't done such a good job at that, right? And so we need to ensure, again, that as we continue to move forward, that we're not talking for people, we're not replacing anything, we are supplementing the amazing work that's already happening, and that we're not recreating the wheel, right? We've seen so many different gaps and opportunities for us to be able to ensure that that connectivity is there, right? As money moves from the federal government to the states, to communities, that communities actually understand and know that there's these opportunities at hand, right? And so there's a lot of amazing work that we're trying to move forward at the Federation. And so I'll stop there because I can continue to go on and on, but that's such a great question, Mary. And so in terms of the ongoing work, I don't see any other additional questions here, but I do have another kind of set of pieces of questions that I'd like to.
Rebecca, do you mind if I interrupt?
Oh, no, please. Yes.
Just on Mary's question too, I think just on externally, I think it's something worth mentioning. And Rebecca stirred my memory of it because she said a scorecard. So we have this amazing internal process that Rebecca and Tatiana and their team deserve so much praise for shepherding through for the last 2 years. But if you listen to the keynote this morning, that CEQ is also working on an EJ scorecard for the full federal government. And that's another thing that as part of that sort of climate executive order that is connected to the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool and Justice 40. I think it's still under development, but the idea, I believe, is that it's going to be sort of a scorecard for EJ programs looking at investments and benefits of those investments. So a way to measure Justice 40 and if we're achieving that goal. So that's something that CEQ is still working on. It sounds, from what I understand of it, incredibly ambitious, but would be another tool to measure outcomes. And I do think that the EJSM tools, though they're not perfect, they're not a silver bullet, could also play this role. I mean, you can imagine this is more of a long-term play, but thinking about if those tools are measuring have a cumulative impact score, we could look at that score over time. And if we were able to combine that with information on, what EPA programs have funded this community, have they gotten funding for clean school buses or to replace lead in their drinking water pipes or for energy efficiency and home weatherization, we can understand sort of how much money has been funneled to this community, and let's track that cumulative impact score over time to see if there's an improvement, to see if we're actually if the community is benefiting from the investments there. So that's a long-term play, but an idea of the potential of these tools and what they could be used for. So just to note there on some other tools that that CEQ is working on, but also something that I'm excited about or would be excited about seeing these EJSM tools being used for. And sorry again for interrupting, Rebecca.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Jessica. And I appreciate kind of the connectivity, right, of some of the work and efforts that have been said. So thank you so much. And I'm wondering too, are there others that would like to kind of weigh in on Mary's question as well? All right. Well, thank you. And in terms of, again, kind of thinking about big green organizations, right, and just not moving away from that topic, how can the National Wildlife Federation and other big green organizations continue to support frontline and fence line communities? And this is a question that anyone can answer. So I will ask it again. So how can the National Wildlife Federation and other big green organizations support frontline and fence line communities?
I'll take a crack at it from my perspective, working in industrial policy. I think because a lot of the industrial policy solutions for decarbonization are technological. A lot of conservation groups feel like maybe it's not their space. And I'm really grateful to be a part of a team that, sees the big picture in terms of our involvement in all spaces related to climate change. Because what we often find is that in these often very technological spaces, NWF is one of very few conservation-based organizations that provides input and feedback, and even serves as a watchdog sometimes to make sure that these that industry and these sectors are developing in a way that is going to be equitable and reduce impact. And so I think that it's exactly what you were saying, Rebecca, that it's not about substituting for what communities are saying, but following that pyramid, I almost said pyramid scheme, following that pyramid scenario to take what frontline communities, their largest concerns are and what they know best, which is their community, and elevating those concerns to a level to make sure that DOE and other federal agencies are integrating those concerns into the tools that they're creating, integrating the concerns into the processes that they're using to gather information to then make these decisions. And so I think that oftentimes by choosing not to engage because this isn't a traditional big green space, there's a lot of voices that I think that could be amplified that aren't being amplified in these spaces. And the unfortunate reality, and sometimes fortunate reality, is that in the case of carbon removal, as a solution, the money has been placed. The check has been signed. And so I think really we need to start having robust conversations about how this money is being spent, who it's going to, who's making these decisions, just like Jessica said. So when the funnel gets more narrow, that the money is actually doing what it was allotted to do. And so I think that we spend time kind of debating the should we, shouldn't we, when the decisions that have been made at the very top have already decided something. And so having more organizations like NWF choose to participate and have difficult conversations and agree to disagree on particular issues is a great way to amplify the voices and carry community concerns all the way up that channel to make sure that the money that is being signed off on, the money that is being spent, is going to benefit people in all of the ways that it can.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in more generally and think about like how big greens can do better community engagement, on a lot of these topics. And I think it's important to be bold and, like Simone said, don't shy away from these hard conversations, and going into community realizing that they are the experts and treating them as such, treating them as experts, and not going in with the intention to educate or to provide something for them, because listening is so much more important, because a lot, like as I said a bit earlier, community leaders know what all of the issues are and oftentimes know exactly what the solutions are and where they lie, just don't necessarily have the technical capacity or the resources to realize those solutions, to bring them into reality. So coming in with that knowledge is really, really important, and knowing that you can't be an expert in every community. Like all community issues are different, and they are really complicated. And so coming in with that knowledge of like, okay, I need to come in and learn and open myself up to different ways of solving a problem is the first step, I think.
And I'll round out the answer. Want to elevate and echo everything Simone and Tatiana just said. I think also thinking about it from maybe the other side of it is like a lot of what we do is work with policymakers at the federal level. So that's folks on Capitol Hill, that's people in the White House, and it's one of the big challenges I think is useful to acknowledge here is that like the timeline on which things work is very different in DC with legislation versus like when we're thinking about robust, meaningful, authentic community engagement, building relationships, listening and learning, coming in from a place of like understanding the history of our organization, the harms we have caused, and like starting from there and building a relationship. Those are two very different timelines. And so sometimes what we have to do is, and I think what we try and do and probably do a better job along with all of our other big greens is push the policymaker folks and like educate them about like what needs to happen for meaningful, authentic community engagement to further environmental justice. I think there's a hunger and desire to do the right thing with policymakers around EJ writ large, but sort of what that means practically sometimes can get lost because folks are just like, they know it's important, but like what it means, how to actually achieve it is one other matter. So I actually think the way that the Environmental Justice for All Act, and Tatiana and Rebecca can speak far more intelligently about this than I can, but the way that act was built with the community engagement that happened there, I think is a really great case study and example for how bill creation can actually engage communities in a thoughtful and robust way. But yeah, that's another thing I would say, just like our role as a big green is in our relationships we have with policymakers is to do a little bit of educating on their part about like, what does this actually mean to build, to like look at policy with an environmental justice or climate justice lens? How do we build it into legislation? How much time does that take? What does it mean to do authentic community engagement? And again, all of that is based off of the bottom of the pyramid. I'm going to keep coming back to that great slide. All of that is based off that foundational work. But that's another thing we can use our position and privilege as a big green to try and do.
Thank you all so much. And just to add on, I mean, I completely agree with all that's been said. And I think is also not having to always be the person in the room, right? I think one thing that we've been trying to do here at the National Wildlife Federation is ensure that we're connecting those relationships and folks, as Tatiana had mentioned, so that people can start to develop their opportunities to influence policy or engage with folks, right? Because we don't want to absolutely not be the gatekeepers, with all these different opportunities, but really, again, kind of sharing and networking and ensuring that folks have that information at hand. And I think one other quick thing too that prompted kind of my thoughts as y'all were talking was just the role of philanthropy and foundations, right? And just given the history of Big Greens already having that established, decades long relationships with folks and funding, I'm really happy to see how a lot of foundations are changing their models of how they are funding different initiatives, right? And so we see this big push right now on trying to ensure that that folks, community-based organizations that are led, for example, by Black, Latina, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander communities and communities of lower wealth, they're directly getting these funds and opportunities and being nimble too in regards to the reporting systems of these different grants, right? Because it's not just about, as Tatiana had mentioned as well, it's about capacity, right? folks that are facing a lot of different issues. And so to be able to not only, provide the resources available to address those issues, but giving that grace as well, that's so critical and necessary, so that folks can help navigate and change and modify things as things move forward, right? And one big kind of piece of that is just given the pandemic, for example. I mean, that just completely shifted and changed the priorities and efforts that the different communities are facing, right? And so it was great to see how a lot of different funders, for example, the Kresge Foundation, who was very gracious in kind of rethinking grants and deliverables and what makes more sense at the moment that we're currently in. And so just want to say, thank you all so much. And we have 2 more minutes, and we want to honor and respect time, but wanted to give folks just an opportunity to share, one last remark, one takeaway that you want to share with folks here that are listening right now. And maybe we can kind of switch orders a little bit. And Tatiana, would you like to just share, some kind of lightning round, big takeaways that you want the audience to leave this session with?
Yeah, my big takeaway is that movement building is crucial. There's a lot that happens on the federal level and on the state level, but I think it's really, really important for us to focus on community. So focus on your friends, your neighbors, your relatives, and really build power that way, because that's how things get done.
Thank you. How about you, Jessica?
I would say, I think building off what Tatiana said, the problems we work on at the Federation, climate change, environmental justice, are oftentimes really big and scary. So thinking about what change you can affect at the local level can be a way to sort of tackle and feel a little like you're making a difference, because you absolutely are. And I think also I want to emphasize, as Tatiana said, we are in a transformational moment with the legislation that is hopefully about to pass. Obviously, we need to build on it and do better. But I think taking a moment to stop and celebrate the victory is also really nice, because we haven't had a lot of those, certainly in the climate space, in a while.
Dr. Stewart?
I'll just wrap it up and I'll say that, approaching every problem with humility is really how things can be changed. And so the humility and recognition of our organization and its history, approaching communities with humility to do the best that we can for them, and really, as a scientist, approaching the science solutions with humility, and kind of discarding the hubris that we think that we can solve every little problem, but do the best to do what's right for the most people.
Well, you said it best, Dr. Stewart, and everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And please feel free, if you want to learn more information, check out our website, nationalwildlifefederation.org, and look at all these different initiatives and work that we're doing. And we hope you all enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a good one. Thank you all.